So as you're all obviously aware from the title of this, we're going to talk about digital ID, and I think it's an important area of the financial and related professional services, because bear in mind it's not just financial institutions that are using people's ID and they're doing the KYC checking across the industry, but all sorts of firms across the industry, whether they're professional services or financial services, use ID and spend millions and millions of pounds verifying, authenticating and authorizing its customers, even either when they're doing so when they join as customers or whether they're doing so regularly, I beg your pardon, for some kind of regulatory provision, or whether it's daily for transactions. And unfortunately for this industry, there isn't really an upside. Checking somebody's identity doesn't generate a penny of additional revenue, but there are huge downsides if you get it wrong. And in terms of checking identity for transactions, I know of one global bank that currently has 4,000 people around the world investigating what turn out to be false positives, which is those transactions which look suspicious but turn out not to be. And even in low-cost countries, that's got to be at least about $200 million a year on something which has a zero return on investment. And when you look across at other areas, the Atlantic Council and Thomson Reuters, which are now Refinitiv, estimated that only around 2% of criminal transactions are detected every year. So the answer to all this could be a robust, efficient, and common digital identity system. But this has been tried before and with very limited success, and especially in terms of its broad adoption. Today, I think our hypothesis is that the time is now right for this, and I'm going to test that with a superb panel of experts from across the industry. Over on my far side, we have Derek Ryan, who's a forensic partner at Deloitte. Then we have Kerry Goodwin, who is the Director of Growth and Advisory at Santander. James Moynihan, who's the VP of Product and Development at Evenim. And Hussein Kasai, who's the co-founder and CEO of Onfido. And I've got a number of questions that I'd like to ask the panel. I think probably we're also going to get some via the app. By the way, if you have the Innovate Finance Global Summit app, if you go on to the event that we're now on and you tap on that app, you'll see there's a place there that you can submit a question. If you do that, I'll get it up on this iPad, and we'll see if we can get some questions from the audience as well. But I've got a number of questions that I'd like to ask the panel first. But I'd just like you briefly, if you could, to tell us why you think the time is now right for this to succeed and what you're doing in this particular space. And Derek, if I could start with you.
Thanks, Marcus. Good afternoon, everyone. One word, collaboration. So I think what has changed over the recent past is the ability of the public and private sector to come together to create an ecosystem, more broadly a marketplace for digital identity to truly take hold.
Okay. From my perspective, I very much see it as individuals are being told that they have to take control of their data, and I think what's lacking is the privacy services and infrastructure that we need to provide as an industry through collaboration, as Derek says, in order to do that. And why now? I think the world is more digitally savvy. I also think the UK is taking a very slow progress towards this, and it's an opportunity we need to seize now.
I think I'd agree with that. I mean, despite the billions of pounds that are spent on digital transformation every year, the only single view of me as a customer is the one that exists at home on paper in my filing cabinet. So what we see coming together is really a trifecta of factors. We've got consumer sentiment demanding, as Kerry said, more control, more respect over their personal data. You've got a regulatory imperative to have very high levels of assurance, but also to collect as little data as you realistically need to be able to meet that bar. But finally, you've got some enabling technologies that actually make it possible for the types of collaboration that I think we're all seeking to be done in concert with those values. So it feels in some ways more necessary than ever, but also it feels inevitable.
Good afternoon. So when we talk about portable identity, there is a need to verify someone and whether they are who they claim to be at the point of enrollment and registration. And so why now? Part of the reason is that new technologies have enabled that to be done in a robust way. So since the year 2012 or so, that's when camera quality is improved. So you can take a photograph of your ID. Facial biometrics is improved. Servers have become more accessible so that machine learning models can run, and so on and so forth, so that you can now verify someone remotely in a robust way without having to see them face to face. And on the demand side, as well as the privacy concerns and everything else that goes with it, we live in a world where half the world's adult population are underbanked or unbanked and therefore not included in any sort of financial infrastructure. And the precursor to financial inclusion is identity inclusion. And then you have another issue with everyone here who is on a credit bureau model, for instance. A lot of that data is now hacked or breached, so that it's so easy to commit identity fraud. And identity fraud is the fastest growing crime and the largest crime. So there's never been a, not just more importance, but necessary time for a portable identity ecosystem.
Okay, that's brilliant. And just coming back to that collaboration, if I can, with you, Derek, for a moment. I just wonder if you can give us an overview of what it is that we need to create that identity ecosystem.
So kind of my background heritage is in, and we spoke about earlier today, around AML and AML prevention. So I have been supporting the marketplace more broadly and some of my clients in grappling with, compliance with a smaller capital C. What has been designed for is very much for an analog world. But what is now fast emerging is obviously the digital era, where the nature of service is by and large going to be purely on a digital basis. And therefore, what now needs to be created is, I suppose, the element to trust what is happening and who is doing what at any given point in time. So when I talk about collaboration, it's initially having the foresight to design a model, and there are various different models out there, where self-sovereign or user permission control is at the center of what happens. Because today it doesn't work like that, and there are a number of inherent issues because of that. The distributed nature of emerging technologies, I believe, is also another key enabler. But then it comes back to, well, what problem and issue you're trying to solve for, and context as it relates to identity is important. A financial services audience here today, but there are other identity challenges, industry and geography. So the ability to, in time, build a universal profile where I can walk in and open a bank account, if not, buy something in the shop, and how that merges and forms over time, I think is going to require a little bit of foresight, but that's the big opportunity. And I also believe that the audience here are half a step ahead of the game and have a true opportunity to, I suppose, challenge the status quo, number one, but also start to look at different business models that I know, Kerry, you're having a look at in terms of how this could work.
Thank you. And I want to come back to that in a minute, because I think we all understand that the value of any network is proportionate to the number of people who are using it. So if we can get a digital identity that can be used across multiple sectors. But Kerry, I just want to come back to you first on that point that you made about individuals owning their own data, because that's really important. How do you think we both create that control and allow people to take control of their own data, but then also encourage people to do so? Because if you look at some other examples in the past, it's been very difficult to encourage people to do that. They've been skeptical or just downright suspicious. How do you think we increase the adoption rates?
I think adoption is about, you have to have a compelling proposition for the customer, and that applies to any product or service you offer. But I think the reason I see this as privacy and security, as James says, he's got a nice secure record of himself on bits of paper at home in his filing cabinet. But if I were to ask you how secure is your identity footprint, you probably wouldn't sleep at night. Because whilst you probably passionately keep your passport secure, how many copies of it exist in the world? And your identity is as secure as the weakest link in that chain. But I think we're constantly telling consumers that they must be responsible for their data, but nobody's actually giving them the wherewithal, whether that's technical or informed insight of how to do it. So very much, and I know the four of us are in agreement, we see this as providing the right services to allow people to permission the use of their data in the right way, but then to be able to give people the assurance of the security and privacy around that data. And also that the data that they're sharing is appropriate. So probably the most notable example is proof of age. You're often given far too much information just to prove your age. And I think anybody that avails themselves of any service, big, small, high or low assurance, you're constantly having to identify yourself. And frankly, it's a pain. So I think if you can provide a secure, private with the customer in control of their data that allows them to go through their daily life in a digital world more smoothly, adoption will happen by the point of you're doing the right thing for the right customer at the right time.
Right,
And
okay.
I completely echo Hussein's point about the unbanked and people with thin ID files. We need to use technology to increase inclusivity in our society. And ID is the cornerstone for all of us who move through life quite smoothly, but it's also a huge obstacle for those who can't.
Yeah. And James, you talked about three things coming together, about consumer demand, regulatory demand, or at least regulatory impetus, and tech availability. And so what do you think, that those are obviously three kind of forces adhering to this, but what do you think are some of the building blocks that are kind of going to kind of enable this common ID to come about?
Well, I think the most fundamental one is, as Kerry said, there needs to be a compelling proposition for it. You've got to make it so that people can use these IDs for something that's useful. And where some schemes in the past have fallen down is they've been single use or they've had sort of very infrequent use cases, and the default user experience then becomes the I forgot my password user experience, as opposed to the I'm having a magical digital onboarding experience. So what is really going to enable that, though, is a set of sort of principles that stand behind it. So there's not going to be one digital ID that is going to work in every context, both inside financial services, but also as you broaden that into retail and travel and healthcare and so on and so forth. And it's pointless to try. So instead of forcing it, I think the most helpful thing to do is to actually remove the impediments. And so that requires a system that has user agency, as Kerry said. So we need to give users the digital equivalents to the physical credentials that they have today, that they can store themselves. And let's face it, managing your digital identity shouldn't be any harder than managing your physical identity, which just means keeping it with you in a wallet or keeping it somewhere safe at home. We do this with our phones all the time. So we have the technology for that. There needs to be acceptance, and that should be universal. So we can't have identity that's only used inside of government, only used inside of the one bank I'm a customer of, etc. And to enable that, you require basically open standards, not just at the protocol level, but again, open principles about who can use it for what and what the data means. And accompanying that, then probably some open governance that says, do you know what, this isn't just a club of us who have come together and said, this is something that solves our one problem. But it recognizes that identity is a very human trait, and as an individual, I pass through many different contexts in the course of my daily lives, both online and off, and I need an identity that works for me in those different settings. So really, the technology does exist for all these things, but what we need to stop doing is taking this kind of myopic view that says, let's solve the problem right in front of us, and we need to be thinking a few steps down the line, because we all know where we want to be, which is, as you said, an inclusive, universal, and frankly, useful digital ID.
Mm. Thank you. And I just want to come to one thing, which is something that we find a lot of the time with our members when we talk to them, which is the reason why most of the time financial institutions and professional services companies will do this themselves. And that is because of the difficulty of relying on other people. So this question of the liability, and I think, in fact, I think it was Nathan Bostock in a particular setting whose key question was, who ends up wearing the orange suit? Because that is, particularly with our senior managers regime, particularly with travelling regularly to the USA, where that can be the big issue. How do you think we address that issue of liability?
So there has been a bit of a tendency to overcomplicate it. It does need to be complicated in the sense that you have a trust framework and an operating model, and all those relying parties or businesses that want to partake in it adhere or accept that. And more importantly, the regulator adheres and sort of endorses it, then it shouldn't matter whether the consumer was verified at the outset with Bank A, FinTech 2, or InsurTech 3, but all have now been verified, and they can port that to the different relying parties and different businesses. So as for specifically when something goes wrong, as it will, it's going wrong right now, but in a much bigger way, how that is addressed, there is an insurance pooling scheme. It depends where the revenue flows to some extent as to who pays should something go wrong. But there are different models to cater for it. The broader point being that the whole ecosystem is much more secure. So there will always be things going wrong, but with this new model, it's going to happen far less frequently than without one.
Mark, can I just maybe add to that, just in terms of kind of from an AML or KYC perspective? think there's a perception today of this kind of golden KYC record that you can magically port between different kind of consumers of that information for whatever service that's required. I think what we're describing here is a very different model, where the trust and the risk still remains with the institution who is consuming the information that's available, but the verification and the endorsement is at the attribute level. So they can effectively pick and choose what is satisfactory for their own risk purposes. So I think it's an evolution of the model. I think it's starting to get much more granular, and you've got that trust framework that we were describing a little bit earlier. So I do think that's a real big opportunity as part of this whole.
And can you foresee a time in the future where Bank A would be willing to rely, even with its regulatory requirements and senior managers regime, that Bank A would be willing to rely on information that had been checked and verified by another party, even though they're going to take on that liability? Do you think you could see that in the future?
Well, I'm not quite sure it's required, given what I've just tried to describe, in the sense that if I'm using information, I could have any number of verifiers of that attribute. Yeah, so I can pick and choose. And if it's another bank, great. It could be the ultimate source of the attribute, could be DVLA for a driver's license. So this whole kind of marketplace in terms of being truly digital will emerge. And again, the institution in question can pick and choose whom they trust, and therefore whether it's acceptable from their risk management point of view. So I think it's a little bit more dynamic. I think it's a little bit more precise, and there is optionality.
Yep. So you would see that there are going to be certain sources of that information that would be more valuable in the way that a passport is considered more secure than a Blockbuster's membership card, for example.
And it was kind of my earlier point in terms of context, because again, we talk about identity and it's kind of, this is a technical phrase, it's all munged together. What we're talking about here is being very precise about what you need to get a service from a bank versus Blockbuster. I'm not quite sure they're still alive, but hey-ho. Versus another. So, you know, the usual kind of use case in terms of you walk into a bar, can I prove my age? I just need a credential that proves my age. I don't need to give across my date of birth. I have a credential that the restaurant, pub, whomever can trust. So again, it's all about context and being precise about what you need to acquire a service based on a compelling proposition.
And as has already been said, it's about having the right standards, having the right trust frameworks, and being clear what level of assurance is appropriate in any given situation.
Yeah.
And just I suppose to make it clearer with an example, there is the case of less frequency but importance, like opening a bank account or a remittance platform. But you have all the way to the other extreme, just accessing a password management system, or logging into your email server, or all the hundreds of different accounts that we have for passwords. It's all falls under the same umbrella of access.
Yeah.
And how it's not necessarily just with the regulatory side, is when you're checking into a hotel, ordering prescription drugs to come to your home, whenever you sort of vote in the whole spectrum. And when it comes to your question, would there come a day where Bank B relies on all the information that has been verified from Bank A? It's not necessarily an all-in approach, where what can be standardized is your legal identity, your date of birth, name, address, your government driving license, your facial biometrics, whatever it may be, that Bank A has verified. Bank B can rely on that. And then where subjective matters or risk matters come in, such as are you on a sanctions list, are you on a politically exposed list, and so on, the Bank B could run all those checks fresh and take a risk-based approach on those. It's just the most friction-heavy pieces for the consumer would have been automated and done in an invisible way, and those additional steps can be taken by each relying party in addition.
So let me just check that I've kind of got the concept of this right. Is in the same way now that with a credit checking agency, if I go to a bank and I want to borrow some money, the bank will do a credit check where they'll get about, 80-85% of the information that they want about me, and that then they will do their own piece on top of that. In other words, am I the kind of customer that they particularly want? Have I got some particular red flags that they don't want to deal with? Is that the kind of thing that you're talking about?
In some ways, it's that what can be binary and that everyone accepts is to a level of assurance. The identity has been verified, the facial biometrics is fine, all of those can be shared. And then additional things such as that are more risk-based. So if you are on a politically exposed persons, maybe your uncle might be a member of the House of Lords, then you are perceived as a risky individual, a risky customer. There's nothing wrong with having a member that's in Parliament, for instance. But for bribery reasons and other things, that bank needs to take extra steps to make sure there's no corruption or any things of that nature. Now, it's hard for them to take their notes from Bank A and rely on that. So they have to come to their own view on those. But from a consumer perspective, the bits that take time is me finding my utility bills, finding my passports, queuing up at a bank to get that done to begin with. So the easy bits can be shared, and the bits that are more risk-based could be still done at an individual level within the banks.
Yeah.
Can I just add to that? I mean, I think we're right to talk about the use cases for this inside financial services, because clearly there's a big opportunity there, especially as services become unbundled and consumers aren't just engaging with one financial services company, but they might engage with traditional banks, challengers, fintechs, etc. And I think Onfido and others have shown that a digital onboarding flow for that is actually a great catalyst for that. So we see big opportunity there. But the other reason that this conversation is being had in this room as opposed to elsewhere is that the level of assurance that banks are required to reach is high enough that identity that they're capable of creating or endorsing then has tremendous value in the rest of that consumer's digital life. And so starting with financial services doesn't necessarily mean we're talking just about using inside that little ecosystem. And we think as that branches out into other aspects of the consumer's life, that's a great thing for the customer and ultimately a great thing for their relationship with the institution that ended up giving them that digital identity.
And how do you think that then spreads across to those other sectors? Because as you rightly say, the value of it is when we have one digital identity that we can use across based on those dynamic kind of standards that can be used. So I know you're all closely working with the FinTech Delivery Panel, but that presumably that work with government is at a level where it's not just going to be applicable for financial services.
Yeah.
What are the kind of next steps with that? And I know there's been some developments today which you might want to talk about.
Well, so broadly, there's three elements to it to allow the identity to be reused across contexts. There's a business, a legal, and a technical. It's the BLT sandwich, which is my absolute favourite. It makes it easy to remember. So, at a business level, as Hussein mentioned earlier, there are some questions around are revenues flowing? If so, is liability shifting? How should that work? That's going to end up as a document that exists between stakeholders in a particular trust framework, a particular network. There's the legal dimension, so who is responsible for what are the levels of assurance, what are the consequences if something goes wrong. Inside of regulated industries, that's quite a large piece of work. Inside of perhaps retail or entertainment sectors, it's a lot lighter. And then there's the technology segment, which is an area that my company's quite strongly focused on, but actually in many ways is the least of it. It's just the dial tone, the common protocol that allows you to move this information around from piece to piece. And so the work we're doing in the FinTech Delivery Panel is very practical. We're not publishing big white papers and things like that. We're taking a thin slice through these three layers of the stack and showing how reuse might work in the real world under the supervision of the regulator.
And I just want to introduce one of the questions from the audience about this, because I think this is relevant at this particular point. The person says, digital identities require definition of standards to ensure scalability and global adoption. In this context, do you foresee competition in the space develop? I mean, I guess, you both got the incentive that you want this to be your company's success story, but do you see that competition developing?
So we have incentives for it to be our company, but I don't think it's practical nor desirable. And even for us, who knows if James Rye will be around in 5 or 10 years. This is just so important that you don't want anyone to either get lazy or to screw it up. Yeah. So the intention is for there to be an open marketplace so that providers are selected based on merits and consumers decide based on their preferences too. Yeah. And that's the way it's been structured as it is.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, as a vendor, we've actually taken the approach to essentially lock it open. So we've open sourced all of the code for our identity network. We're working with a number of our competitors as well as our partners on open standards, and there's an open governance framework which we're all part of that seeks to really get adoption at the industry level. As Hussein said, the marketplace is so large that if we're successful, then getting a slice of that will mean that we'll have a happy life, but the consequences of being unsuccessful and sort of the default financial services ID becoming your Facebook ID, for example, we've seen the effects that has on democracy as well as people's mental health, and I don't think we want to be enabling that any further than we absolutely have to.
And I know, Kerry, you've been central to that government and private sector cooperation to make sure this works right.
Yeah. Because I think that's key. I think both government and regulators have a key role to play here. And I think the challenge is that their role needs to be different from what it's been in the past. Because in order to make this ecosystem work, we need public and private partnership working in a very forward-looking, consumer-orientated way. So customers need to have the right to choose, but also we do need the standards, we need the trust frameworks, but we need a commercially savvy public-private partnership. And I think that's probably the biggest challenge we have, because we don't have too many examples of where we've made those work. But we all have a role to play in making that ecosystem work, because for no other reason than the original source of truth for most of the ID we're talking about is a government department.
Yes.
So we need them as active, collaborating partners.
And I think that's something that a lot of people see as, is this a government job? Should government be doing this? And one of the challenges, of course, is government's had a couple of goes at this and failed abysmally. And so therefore the private sector is doing it because there's a commercial need, a consumer need, and regulator need. How do you see that relationship working between public and private so that the people whose identity we're talking about can be comfortable that this isn't just being done in the interests of a company?
Yeah, I think the point of difference at the moment, Marcus, is around that kind of collaboration. And I think it's been manifested, again, I heard description this morning in terms of the sandbox, which is under the guise of the FCA, who are then taking a very active role on and this is kind of designed to build to test for rather than to speak about, which I think is very, very important as an ethos, both for a UK PLC, but more broadly, how this is going to succeed, and learn from some of the lessons of the public-only kind of initiatives where there was a little bit of part-time involvement from the private sector. I think it sometimes is a little bit of a difficult balance, and in my vantage point in terms of the broader marketplace, I do see, however, kind of behaviour changing. And expectation being kind of, well, let's actually do something practical here. Let's learn from that, and then let's start to, apply those learnings. That's quite important.
And Kerry, this has come up a couple of times in this conversation already, but I think it's important to delve into this. How do we avoid that kind of concentration of identity into a very small number of providers? Because we've seen with a lot of the kind of Web 2.0 technology, and whether it's in social media or retail, we're concentrating into a number of really big brands, the FANGs. And how do we avoid that happening in digital ID?
Well, I think James said it when he said, we have to create an open source system. We have to create a marketplace where solutions are interoperable so the client can choose. And I think it's not just choosing one identity provider over another. You could choose many for different paths you want to take in life. Traditionally, we don't tend to put all eggs in one basket is a very kind of British preference. So I think you need to create that dynamic marketplace, because also it drives the right behaviour. If you're getting the right service, you'll continue to avail yourself of that service. If you're not, you should have the right to choose. And the reason we can't allow concentration in any one provider is because it's such a cornerstone. It would be the monopoly beyond all monopolies for ID. So this is why the trust framework and the right regulatory framework and the right government engagement in the ecosystem is critical to keep that balance.
So I think we've... Sorry, did you want to...
No, and it's partly also to learn the lessons from the past, because there already exists a shared identity ecosystem. It's run by the trade credit bureaus. The challenge with that is that as well as many other things, but it's essentially an oligopoly. So that even when there were breaches in the US, there was a class action lawsuit, Congress stopped it. So the next iteration, that's going to be not just a much better approach, needs to be well thought through as to how it could be abused, because it plays such a pivotal role, not just with opening bank accounts or accessing your hotel and things of that nature, but even voting one day will, in our view, be done by you proving your legal identity in an easy way. It's going to be quite central to all activities.
And I think that brings up an interesting point, because I think some people will want to argue that this should be a government initiative, even though governments haven't had a terribly good track record of doing it in the past. And they will look to places like India and China and say, well, look what that's doing to the Indian economy and how it's allowing the unbanked to become banked, because the first time they can establish their identity. I'd just like to go with each of you and just ask you the same question is, Do you think this should be a government initiative? And if not, why not? And then what are the blockers that could potentially get in the way of this? If I could start with you.
Sure. So it ticks every single boxes to argue for why there should be heavy government involvement. Whether the government leads that or not is a different question, because it's unlikely to do a good job. But if it were to heavily be involved and regulate, it absolutely should. And so India is kind of a bit like a leaking bucket model, doesn't work. In China, there's a privacy issue. If Facebook does an identity, there's like a creepiness with them doing it. If it's like a crypto identity, then that's like a Mad Max world. That's unlikely to work. So we're kind of in good shape because there's a fair few initiatives that are now running and proving that it's working. So one of these, if not multiple of them, will take off. And it's so good that the regulators are involved from this early stage so that they can monitor and control and make sure it's done in the right measured way.
And if you had a magic wand, what single roadblock would you get rid of?
There are just some very minor, it's mostly down to interpretation, but GPG 45 and other government standards and regulations around levels of assurance and how they can help be compliant with anti-money laundering legislation is to make those more clear so that all the banks and all the relying parties accept if a person's done these three things, then they're good enough to, or they are compliant enough to be held an open account. But even that work is being done on that to improve it as we speak.
Why not government, and which roadblock?
Well, I think identity is not a singular thing. I think we all show up differently in different contexts, and so it's very important that whatever digital infrastructure we put in place allows for context-appropriate proof about your identity rather than just this notion of one single digital identity. So, I think that for regulated industries and for kind of the breeder documents, the citizen identity, government clearly plays an enormous role. They decide who is and isn't citizens, and also they decide what the rules are, as Hussein said, for accessing certain services. So government should absolutely be, in my view, a sort of proactive and very supportive partner in this. I don't think a top-down government-driven approach is necessarily the right way to go. You could talk about track record, but also I just think that we're trying to design something that is bigger than just the use cases in this room, and so it's important, I think, to allow an open ecosystem to try and tackle those problems.
And your biggest roadblock?
The biggest roadblock, I think it does come down to a lack of clarity, actually. I'm less well-versed in the specific particular acronyms as saying this, so I won't quote them, but in general, there are lots of misperceptions and fears around taking things online, whether the involvement of your government or your bank or other parties means they get to learn all about your online activities. We saw a lot of that in the press with the regulations coming in around proof of age for access to adult content, for example. So I think the single biggest roadblock is let's get the boogeymen out of the picture here, and let's just be really clear and really objective about what we're trying to achieve and how it works. I think by and large, citizenry is capable of responding to that when they're given the right information.
Kerry, is that what consumers want? They want a private sector solution, or do you think that consumers will be able to will be willing to go with this kind of private-public partnership?
I think, as I've already, it has to be a public and private partnership with equal participation of government and the commercial sector. And I think customers absolutely have to have the choice that I've mentioned beforehand, because as James has said, the ID is just the cornerstone. Your driving licence, your passport, this is just the cornerstone. This is about how we allow individuals to manage their personal data asset in a private and secure way, that they can sleep at night, and also they can be empowered to understand how and where their data is being used and to be in control of it. But we need an ecosystem that allows them to do that, and that can only come from public-private partnership. Because I take the view that the government initiatives didn't fail because it was the government doing it, it's because you can't do it on your own to establish the system.
Brilliant.
And in terms of what we need to move out of the way, as I said earlier, public-private partnerships, we don't have a huge number of really good examples of how you can actually bring that operating model together. So we need to put the right pioneers together and just do it. Yeah. I don't think it's an obstacle. I just think it's a blueprint we haven't written yet.
Derek, same to you.
Yeah, well, listen, I'm not going to disagree with my esteemed panellists in terms of it is a combination. It's between the public and the private, various different degrees in terms of engagement and involvement. One of the blocker for me, I'm very optimistic. I think there's a huge opportunity in terms of digital era, kind of marketplace opportunity, the experience of consumer, bringing that all together, and I think it's almost organically going to happen. Now, if there's anything that's going to kind of hold that back, it's probably the cutover between analog and digital, and how is that done in a safe and secure way. But I think, to Kerry's point, if we get the right folk and the right collaborating partners around the table, public and private, that's all surmountable.
Well, thank you all very much. Really appreciate your time today, and thank you all for sharing your thoughts and your views with us. And if you'd like, please to show your appreciation for our panel.